Shabbat Shalom. I know I'm still new to many of you, so I thought it would be worthwhile to talk about something today that's very near and dear to my heart: the Mission Impossible movies. I know they're not Shakespeare, but they're really the top tier of what action movies can be. But what people might not realize is that in between his increasingly dangerous stunts, Tom Cruise is also engaging in increasingly sophisticated ideas. My wife Annika and I went to see the latest Mission Impossible movie earlier this week, and sometime around the time that Tom Cruise drives a motorcycle off a cliff, free falls hundreds of feet, opens a parachute, and then steers that parachute so that he lands on a moving train, around that time I thought to myself, this movie actually has a lot to say about this week's Parsha. Okay, I know you might have a little bit of skepticism, but in the movie, they're fighting, the bad guy is not a guy at all. It's actually an evil artificial intelligence. And the way that this evil AI plans to take over the world, spoiler alert, is not only by taking control of the world's military capabilities, but just as importantly, taking control of the world's media. One of the henchmen says this will be the chance to control the truth, the concepts of right and wrong for everyone for centuries to come. And because the AI is so smart, it can predict what Tom Cruise is going to do, so it manipulates the outcomes to leave him seemingly with no choice but to betray his friends. But Tom Cruise is able to save the day anyway. And how does he do it? Because he says, there's always a choice. There's always a choice. This week we begin the book of Dvarim, in which Moses gives a great speech recounting everything the Israelites had experienced in the 40 years between leaving Egypt and where they are now on the precipice of the Promised Land. But in some cases, Moses' version of the story recounted decades later has significant differences from the original version that we read earlier in the Torah earlier this year. You can take, for example, the story of the spies. In the original version, in the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, 12 spies sent out to scout the land. Most of them come back with a really negative report. People there are giants. We look like grasshoppers next to them. Yeah, they've got really big grapes, but there's no way that we can handle them in battle. It's hopeless. And then the Israelite people hear that, and they panic. They ask to go back to Egypt. And so because of the spy skepticism, God decrees that the whole generation will die out without entering the Promised Land. So that's the Bamidbar version. Now, today, in the first chapter of Deuteronomy, we hear Moses' version of the same story. So see if you can spot the difference. 12 spies are sent out to scout the land. When they come back, what do they say? Tovah ha'aretz asher Adonai Eloheinu noten lanu. It's a good land that Adonai, our God, is giving to us. This is a glowing report. The land is full of delicious fruit. It's ripe for the taking. But again, this is in Moses' version. It's the Israelites who panic. They say, God hates us. We're going to lose the battles. The spies mention something about giants. We want no part of that. And that's when God reacts and criticizes the Israelites for their lack of faith and decrees that the whole generation will die without entering the land. So how do we make sense of the discrepancies and reconcile these two narratives? If you look closely or listen closely, they both have pretty much the same material. It's just that the emphases are totally different. In the original version, in Bamidbar, the emphasis is on the spies' negative report. It's not exactly fake news, because in later books in the Bible, we do hear about giants like Goliath, but it's definitely skewed news. The problem is what the spies said. But this morning, in Dvarim, the emphasis is on the people's reaction, that they only paid attention to the negative part of the spies' report and not the positive part. In the Bamidbar narrative, it's the consequences because of the skewed news of the spies. In this week's reading, the consequences because of the people's reaction to the news. Their acceptance of what they're told without question, without critical thinking. Version A, the issue is the report. Version B, the issue is the reaction. So it sort of begs the question, why do we have this version B in the Torah in the first place? If you think about it, the spies were picked as the elite of the Israelite elite, the best candidates from each of the tribes. And if they, of all people, lost their nerve, it would make sense for God to say, well, if they don't have faith, then nobody will. So why do we have this second report that we read today, which focuses totally on the people's reaction? Nechama Leibowitz, the great 20th century scholar, had a fascinating explanation, and I quote, "The Torah here wishes to teach us an important lesson. Human beings are put to the test by God at every moment of their existence. The ears hear and the heart is seduced. The question becomes, is the listener who is misled by the seducer free from all moral responsibility? The Torah makes each person responsible for his or her actions. The listener has a choice of turning a deaf ear to evil and misleading words. Choice belongs to each of us. We have the duty to resist. Each of us has to be his or her own leader, responsible for every action, and not just a cog in the vast machine called society. End quote. In other words, there's always a choice. We are responsible for thinking and acting critically and independently, and of making correct choices regardless of the messages that we receive from people in power. After all the miracles the Israelites had experienced, the 10 plagues, the splitting of the sea, the revelation at Sinai, food literally falling from the sky, they should have thought critically about whether a few giants were really too much for them to handle with God's help. But instead, when they were presented with this skewed report, they chose not to think, which of course is sometimes the most consequential choice of all. Judaism stresses again and again that we have free will. We have the freedom to choose whether to follow the Yetzer Tov or the Yetzer Ra, the good inclination within us or the bad inclination within us. At the end of the book in Dvarim, which we'll get to in a couple months, or a month and a half, Moses actually concludes this very, very long speech that he started today with this exact point, the thesis statement of all the experiences in mitzvot he'd been talking about up until then. God has put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Uvcharta b'chaim, choose life. The key is you always have a choice. Even if circumstances are constrained, it might be difficult, but it's never impossible to do what we all know deep down is the right thing to do. It's much easier to absolve ourselves of that responsibility, the responsibility of critical thinking, of telling ourselves we don't have a choice at all, that we have to accept the truth of what we're being told. The problem with that, especially in our age of social media bubbles, is that it's very tempting to choose to receive and choose to accept information that confirms our biases over the obligation to hear the truth, sometimes with devastating effects. We don't have to look far to see examples of how conspiracy theories took root after people chose to accept implausible or impossible claims from leaders who should know better. January 6th riot might come to mind, others might come to mind for you. We can't forget that anti-Semitism itself is the oldest conspiracy theory of them all, based on people choosing to accept illogic, lies, false reports without doing the work of questioning. Some of us have been following the ongoing trial of the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter, in which evidence has been introduced that he was radicalized by choosing to dig deep into anti-Semitic social media sites. But lest anyone think that this phenomenon is just the problem of one political party or one social group, I think it's worth pointing out that before the pandemic, when they ranked the zip codes across the country that had the lowest compliance with childhood vaccination regulations, some of the wealthiest parts of Los Angeles ranked the worst. There were private schools in Beverly Hills and Santa Monica that had lower vaccination rates than South Sudan. And that led to outbreaks, preventable outbreaks of measles and whooping cough because educated, well-connected, wealthy parents believed conspiracy theories about vaccines rather than choosing to use their critical thinking skills. In all these cases, you could say that people got a report that on the face of it made no sense, but that report did confirm their biases and conform with their fears. So instead of choosing the hard path of thinking critically about what they were receiving, they chose instead, to borrow Leibovitz's phrase, not to turn a deaf ear to evil and misleading words. For all of these examples, the lesson of this week's Parsha is that we are on the hook for the choices we make. Regardless of what media bubbles we live in, regardless of whether a person in prominence told us that up was down, there's no I'm just following orders defense, or even I'm just following the crowd. The buck stops with me. The buck stops with each of us. The powerful gift of free will comes with an equally powerful responsibility to think critically and act honorably. Because the thing about choices is, right, when you make one, there's always another one to make, which can be hard, but also means that no one is stuck on the path they started out on. Tshuva, which literally means returning, is not just limited to the high holidays. Any day can be the day that you choose to take a new direction, to think critically about the stuff you once accepted unquestioningly, to make a different choice. There's always a choice. And as Moses says, as he concludes his speech at the end of Dvarim, we're called upon to choose responsibility for our own actions, to choose the path of blessing, to choose life. That is our mission if we choose to accept it. Shabbat Shalom.